every UFC pay-per-view event has been booked leading up to UFC 300. So 297 with Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis. 298 is booked with Volkanovski versus Topuria, and 299 is booked with O'Malley versus Chito 2. That means all three of these title fights are not possible for UFC 300, unless the winner of Strickland and Dricus are that crazy to turn around that quickly. So UFC 300 is lacking title fight options, which tells me that Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler absolutely is going to be on that card. I know Ariel Helwani came out and said that, they're going to have Conor for a later event, maybe 301 or something, because he's such a big star. UFC 300 sells itself, so might as well have two big events that sell, the other one with Conor on it. But I don't agree with this. If you don't have Conor on UFC 300, it just doesn't have the star power. Look at all the champions that are most likely not going to fight on that card. So we look at Tom Aspinall. Aspinall can fight on UFC 300, but we know that he doesn't want to fight Ciryl Gane. He's not going to fight John Jones because Jones is injured. Stipe is going to be waiting out for Jones. And Almeida's too low of a ranked opponent, which tells me if Aspinall is on 300, it's going to be against maybe Volkov again, maybe Almeida, who knows? And that's not a star-driven fight at all. Alex Pereira could fight on UFC 300 if he goes up against the winner of Ankalaev and Johnny Walker, but Dana did say that Pereira's next opponent is Jamal Hill. So he's going to wait for Jamal Hill's return, and that's probably going to happen, I would guess, in the summer. Strickland is booked. The welterweight champion is possible, whether it's Leon or Colby, but we do know that these two guys don't fight that often, so I don't expect them to fight in April. Islam is not going to fight there because he won't fight during or right after Ramadan. So no Islam versus Oliveira. Volk is booked. O'Malley's booked. Pantoja is possible with a quick turnaround. And then the two female title fights, Grasso versus Valentina and Weili versus Xiaonan, are available for UFC 300. So honestly, it looks like the only logical two title fights that can be on UFC 300 are the two female title fights. Grasso versus Shevchenko 3 and Weili versus Xiaonan. Bro, if they put the bantamweight title fight on that card, Pena versus somebody, come on, man. So this is what tells me that Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler is going to be on UFC 300. And then they can also stack it up with other great ones as well. So let's line up UFC 300. As the main event for UFC 300, I would put Conor versus Chandler. It's not normal to have a non-title fight over title fights, but this is meant for casual fans. And we know that Islam is not going to fight during Ramadan, so he's out, right? That was going to be my number one option if it wasn't going to be Conor versus Chandler. The casual fans are regardless going to want to see Conor versus Chandler, so have that as the main event. This is such a crazy fight, a definite early knockout. Either Conor catches Chandler with the left hand coming in, or Chandler bangs it out and throws some big overhand at Conor, knocking him out. Chandler's path to victory is mostly going to be in the wrestling. I think if he strikes for Conor too long, he's going to get caught, as Chandler is quite defenseless on a lot of stuff he does with his boxing. Doesn't pick his hands up too much. He's quite obvious on what he's trying to throw at you from a distance, and nobody's better against orthodox, heavy right-handed fighters like Conor McGregor, countering the opponent's right hand from distance, slipping on it, and hitting him with the left hand. That's something I could see happening for Conor in this fight. He also does have the head kicks as well. I would also think that Conor has a better gas tank than Chandler, but who knows with all the weight fluctuation Conor's been having over the years. He's gotten so big and now he's getting smaller again. Who knows where his cardio is actually going to be at. But we see him go 5 rounds before against Nate Diaz. Now Chandler would have to wrestle, right? Chandler can wrestle Conor, take him to the ground, hit him with big ground and pound shots, and try to look for a finish there. And Conor's not too bad on the ground, right? Against Khabib, he's going to look pretty bad. But even there, he did better than a lot of other Khabib's opponents. But anything Conor tries against Chandler off his back, I think is going to get defended. But the thing is, does Chandler go that route? Because there's expectations about Michael Chandler. The casual fans do not expect Chandler on going out there and wrestling with Conor. They expect this guy to brawl with Conor and just throw hands the whole time. We do know that he likes to cater to the fans. He likes to fight by their expectations. And even if he were to win by wrestling, it will look like a loss, like a quote-unquote loss in a lot of fans' eyes. Unless he picked him up, slammed him on his head, and KO'd Conor. That would be crazy, but I do expect Chandler to throw hands with Conor a bit more, especially in the first round before trying any wrestling. I think the point where he starts wrestling is after he gets caught. But that one shot from Conor could end it for good, and he may not get another chance to wrestle. So plug that in, main event for UFC 300. The co-main event, I would have Alexa Grasso versus Valentina Shevchenko 3 to finally finish this rivalry, have a conclusion to all the craziness that's been happening between these two. It's a rivalry that none of us expected, but these two are so evenly matched. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes to a draw or something. Do I expect it to be a very fun fight? Not necessarily. I think it's going to have the same kind of excitement that the other two fights had, other than the finish, of course. I know a lot of fans are going to be going back and forth as to who is going to win a third fight, which makes it a very compelling fight. If Grasso is able to beat Shevchenko in their trilogy, that Dome event that Dana's been talking about having for Mexican Independence Day would be massive for Grasso moving forward. I mean, a big win over Shevchenko at UFC 300 is going to get a lot of eyes on her. She's going to get a huge following going into that Independence Day event, which will blow the roof off the place. Now, maybe some of you would be asking, what about Blanchfield? What about Furat? I think those two should fight each other because they're both like the #1 contender. They both deserve a title shot, so they should go against each other in a #1 contender fight. So plug that in for UFC 300's co-main event. The third fight, which is another title fight, I would have Zhang Weili versus Xiaonan. This would break history as the only fight between two Chinese fighters, and they'll be having it at UFC 300. That'd be insane. And of course, Weili's gonna win. Of course. There's really anybody that could beat Weili right now, but this is the next logical opponent for her. And with a big win against Xiaonan at UFC 300, Weili's gonna get even bigger as a star, especially if she gets a finish out there. I don't really see Xiaonan beating Weili at anything. I mean, when it comes to the wrestling, Weili's evolved so much there. Her striking is overall better. Her jiu-jitsu is way better as well. She's better, has higher fight IQ. She's gone 5 rounds routinely throughout her career. She has so many advantages against Xiaonan. We don't have to talk about the power difference between them. Xiaonan has 1 knockout. Weili can hurt anybody she goes up against. Right? She's the fighter that cracked Andrade's chin. Way before Xiaonan knocked out Andrade, Weili did it when nobody thought anybody could knock out Andrade in her prime as a champion. So plug that in as the second title fight on UFC 300. Now after that, you can get kind of creative. There's a lot of matchups you could put together. The next 2 fights for the main card, because main cards are usually 5, the next 2 fights on the main card have to have some kind of star power. So Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway. We know these two want to fight each other, and the BMF title game put on the line would make sense. And with Islam not fighting in Ramadan, is probably going to fight later in the year against Oliveira. Gaethje's going to be out for a pretty long time if he doesn't have any opponent. But he did say the only guy he would be willing to go up against is Max Holloway. So Gaethje versus Max at UFC 300 is an interesting fight to put together. Now there is a lot of talk about, is Max even ready for 155 again? He didn't make the adjustments on his body to get used to that weight because he did fight at 155 against Dustin, and the size did show to be a big problem for him. The punches from Dustin were hurting him, and we know that Dustin, shot for shot, does not hit as hard as Gaethje. Gaethje has 1-shot knockout power, whether it's the head kick that he landed on Dustin or his hands, knocking out Edson Barboza, James Vick, who does have a glass chin, Dan Lozon back in the day. He could drop you like he did Donald Cerrone. The amount of times he hurt Michael Chandler, like this guy hits very different. And if Max is not ready for the power again, if his body's not ready for it, I think he could get finished by Gaethje. If Dustin was hurting him, like rocking him actually, which even to that level we don't see happen to Max too often, I think Gaethje would be the first fighter to put Max down, especially this version of Justin Gaethje. He's better than he's ever been. His leg kicks too. Max sometimes does not check leg kicks, and not checking leg kicks against this guy would destroy Max's entire foundation in the fight. He wouldn't be able to throw too much power. He wouldn't be moving the same way, and then conditioning that for head kicks. Max would have to be a little bit more aggressive against Gaethje to not allow Gaethje to establish any kind of pace here. Max has to be the one that establishes the pace in order to have success, but I do think ultimately it's a pretty bad fight for Max. I think this goes worse for him than the Dustin fight did. A lot of people actually forgot that Max versus Dustin was not entirely one-sided. It started off one-sided, but then it started to become more competitive as the fight was going on. With Gaethje though, I think the damage will settle in so quickly, I don't think there's much of a chance for it to get competitive later. And we do know that both fighters can fight for 5 rounds too, so plug that in for another fight on the main card at UFC 300, and technically a third title fight. And then the first fight on the main card, Khamzat Chimaev versus Jared Cannonier, is the next fight I would put together for this card. We know already that Khamzat's going to get a higher ranked opponent, someone most likely in the top 3, top 5. Cannonier was already rumored for Khamzat before. Khamzat had his eyes set on him before his last fight, and this is the one that should get put together. After Dricus, I do believe Cannonier is the next guy in line for a title shot in terms of merit, right? He has a win over the champion. He's coming off an amazing performance against Vettori. And if Khamzat can get a win over someone like this, it should do wonders for him to get that next title shot. So I think Khamzat versus Cannonier is the fight to put together. And honestly, I would say every fight on the main card should be 5 rounds. I would love to see Khamzat versus Cannonier be 5 rounds, and then the next fight as well. Now, this is going to be a grappler versus striker matchup. Khamzat does not want to do anything on the feet with Cannonier. He is completely outgunned. Cannonier is more skilled in the stand-up. He has more variety of attacks, from devastating leg kicks to the boxing ability that he has. Switching stances, has impeccable timing with his hands. And right now, I would say probably the most power out of any other middleweight, especially now that Pereira moved up. But we know that first round is going to be devastating with Khamzat's grappling. He is going to be very hard to shake off for Cannonier in that first round. But given how big Cannonier is, how strong and powerful he is naturally, he can wear down Khamzat by constantly defending his takedowns more than anybody else Khamzat has fought so far. We talk about Usman for an example. So Khamzat did get injured in the fight, but he was slowing down after the first round. With the way that he was moving, with the way that he was throwing punches, with the way that he was shooting takedowns, it is very hard to shoot takedowns and could even fatigue you even more by trying to grapple with an injured hand because you have to use more strength. But the thing is, Usman is way smaller than Cannonier. Cannonier is a legitimate middleweight. This guy's walking around, I would guess, over 210 pounds. Usman in that fight, I'm pretty sure at most was 200. At most. I would think even less because we do know that he walks around in the 190s and in shape. I would guess Cannonier is about 20 pounds heavier than Usman. And he's going to feel like it against Khamzat. If the fight gets out of the first round, Khamzat is going to be in trouble if he cannot get the fight to the ground from there. But I would say in a 3-round fight, it's going to favor Khamzat. In a 5-round fight, if they go this direction, which I don't think they will, but it would be awesome to see the entire main card be 5 rounds. 5 rounds, it definitely favors Cannonier. That is such a polar opposite fight with the way these two guys approach it. It'd be so fun with the level of suspense the whole time because you know Cannonier can hurt this guy, right? If Gilbert Burns is dropping you, imagine the cannons from Cannonier on your face and the leg damage as well. Cannonier has insanely good leg kicks. At any point in the fight, Cannonier can definitely hurt Khamzat, but then Khamzat can also ragdoll Cannonier. So plug that in as another fight on the main card. Then we go to the prelims. I would say the fight that should headline the prelims, Yair Rodriguez versus the long-lost Brian Ortega. Nobody's seen this guy in like 10 years, and hopefully he could come back for that rematch, as their first fight together was kind of strange. Yair's coming off a loss. Arnold Allen already has a fight, because that was the one I was looking forward to, if you could put Yair against Allen, but Ortega needs a fight back, and he's number 3, so it makes sense to put him and Yair together again. You have the crazy striking of Yair Rodriguez with an improved guard game, as even shown against Ortega before. Ortega's been out for some time, but he has taken a long time off before and came back with an impressive performance against the Korean Zombie. So we do know a lot of time off for him doesn't really devolve him. He's still got the power, he still has the better grappling on paper, where he's supposed to be, but definitely cannot be getting in arm bars like that. And from that injury, that could be a target for Yair if he gets taken to the ground. Ortega's got to tough his way through a lot of it, getting close in that long, unpredictable striker, not get kicked too much on the way in, and try to take this guy to the ground. If Brian Ortega could develop good wrestling, this guy would be very hard to beat, but he just does not wrestle like that. He shot a couple takedowns in his career, but man, I would like to see most of his focus being on takedown ability, but he falls in love with the boxing so much. I don't think it helps him in a matchup with Yair Rodriguez or a lot of other guys right now in the top 5. Petr Yan versus the winner of Rob Font versus Deiveson Figueiredo. So we know that Petr Yan was supposed to fight Song Yadong, but he got injured. Now Song is fighting Chris Gutierrez. I would hope Yan would be ready for April to fight either Font or Figueiredo. We know Font and Figueiredo fighting each other. The winner of that fighting Yan makes a lot of sense in my opinion, especially if it's Figgy. If it's Figgy, that fight's actually pretty big. 2 former champions from different divisions going at it. That would be pretty interesting to watch. I would love to see what Figueiredo's power looks like at bantamweight. We know in the flyweight division, he's like Captain Falcon down there, putting down everybody with a punch. Now imagine if he's even more powerful with the added weight and not having that crazy weight cut. He was cutting way too much weight. I can even imagine him hitting harder at 135. He might be walking around in the 160s, high 150s, but ultimately I do think Yan could be a bit too much for Davis. Deiveson. I think he's a more technical striker overall. He has higher fight IQ. He has the wrestling he could go to. We did see Deiveson get taken down by Brandon Moreno multiple times in their fights. And the thing is also, Figgy is a bit older and he's taking a lot of damage. Those Moreno fights, man, I don't think either guy has come out of that rivalry the same way. They went to war after war with each other. So I do think that Jan could get Figgy to throw some of those right hands and counter it. He does a very good job of covering up on the initial power punch and then countering behind his own guard. He did that very well against Sean O'Malley, who also likes to throw that power hand from distance, right? Both him and Figgy are very precise and confident in their right hands. Jan could use that against Figgy to counter him, as Figgy also keeps his hands low, right? He doesn't usually pick up his hands. He doesn't usually cover up. He has so much confidence in his own chin. And against a bigger opponent in Jan, right? He's bigger than anybody Figgy's ever fought before. This is the kind of guy that can hurt him, right? So Figgy has to be a lot more aware of the 135 power. At 125, he was a Hulk. Here's a little bit different, man. These are guys that are around his size and if not a little bit bigger. Then the third prelim fight, I would have Mateusz Gamrot versus Benoit Saint Denis. Benoit's been on a roll, man. A lot of finishes. He's gotten so much better in his career. And he's calling out guys like Justin Gaethje way higher than him in the rankings. And I do think a step up in competition is the next move for him. The perfect matchup was going to be Rafael Fiziev, but Fiziev is out with an ACL injury, so I think Gamrot is a good secondary option. Where both guys are fairly well-rounded, Gamrot is more focused on the grappling aspect. Benoit's more of a risk taker. I think he's more dangerous than Gamrot in his total approach. He's bigger than Gamrot, he hits harder than Gamrot, he could be a bit wild, but Gamrot doesn't have that kind of power to out-trade Benoit. And he's the kind of guy that could defend the takedowns as well, force Gamrot to stand with him, but Benoit has to be more careful on pulling those guillotines. He could be a bit too excited on finishing openings. So that will be my third fight on the prelims, Gamrot versus Benoit. And then the fourth prelim fight, I would have Jack Della Maddalena versus Ian Garry, if his wife's ex-husband allows him, because he seems to be the man in the house. We have the based Jack Della, but whatever you think of Ian Garry and Jack Della's personalities, they're both good strikers, right? They could put on a very interesting fight. I think Jack Della is a lot better with the fundamentals. His defense overall is way better than Ian Garry's, but the thing is, he's much shorter and slower. So there is a potential for Ian Garry to snipe him, but the beautiful thing about Jack Della, that he's been going up against these long strikers back to back. He fought Randy Brown and he fought Kevin Holland. Going up against Ian Garry is not going to be too different for him, as they're all around the same height, they're all around the same reach, and they all pretty quick to line you up for their power shots. I think Ian Garry can make things more interesting and dangerous with his head kicks, but Jack is very good at fighting behind his guard. He's very good at walking his opponents down and trapping them up against the fence, not allowing a sniper's punches to get through his armor. And I don't think, I could be wrong here, but when I see Ian Garry fight, I don't think he has the chin to take some of Jack's best punches. But I do think Jack should be able to take some of Ian Garry's best shots. So it's going to be a forward, aggressive, plotting approach from Jack versus the elusive, long, moving, sniping approach from Ian Garry. Should be a very good fight. Another prelim fight I would have on there, you have to put on Jim Miller for UFC 300. He fought on UFC 100, 200, he has to go on UFC 300 as well. And the fight I would put together is between him and Jared Gordon. Jared Gordon's getting a lot of respect right now, and a lot of people did watch him pretty much beat Paddy Pimblett. And I think a fight between these two veterans would be amazing to watch. Two guys that always show respect. The hardcore fans get behind them so much. It'd be amazing to see these two fight on UFC 300. And then in the early prelims, this is where I will put the prospects, because you gotta have prospects on UFC 300 to build them up. You know, a lot of eyes are gonna be on the card. Maybe not as much on the early prelims, but if something spectacular happens down there, maybe they can make a highlight reel and promote it. But we do know from UFC 200, a lot of people at least came for the prelims to watch, because you had TJ Dillashaw on there, you had Johnny Hendricks, you had a lot of big names on the prelims, former champions. Hopefully they would come for the early prelims to watch these prospects. So I would have Bo Nickal versus Tresean Gore. So put that fight back together. Tresean Gore was supposed to fight Bo Nickal on UFC 290, got injured and replaced by Val Woodburn on short notice. Let's put that fight together again, because it was actually interesting. Tresean Gore is a good striker at that level. He could be an issue for Bo Nickal if he defends the takedowns. We do know that Bo Nickal's probably not going to strike with him the way he did against the much smaller Val Woodburn. So I expect that fight to be a striker versus grappler matchup, and it creates enough suspense to see if Tresean could catch this guy. And if that happens, how does Bo Nickal get through adversity? The other prelim fight I would have on there is Raul Rosas Jr. You gotta have a prospect like him on the card. A lot of the fans love this kid. We could do to Raul Rosas Jr. versus Cameron Simon. The reason why for this fight is because both guys have two mutual opponents. They both fought Terrence Mitchell and finished him in the first round, and they both lost to Christian Rodriguez. And they're young enough to where a loss from either side doesn't really hurt them too much. They're only going to get better. Simon and Raul are constantly going to get better regardless of what the results of their fight is going to be. So I can expect them to even fight later in their careers, as Simon is 22 and Raul is 19. These are two of the youngest fighters on the roster. I do expect Simon to win. I think he has better pacing. I think he has higher fight IQ. I think he is good enough of a grappler to try to go back and forth a bit with Raul until Raul gasses out. We've seen Raul did gas out before against Christian Rodriguez, but he did have success early against Rodriguez. So we know he's a menacing force in that first round, a similar kind of way that Khamzat is. And Cameron could fight his way around this, right? He can really outsmart Raul out there, understanding of where Raul is most dangerous, and it's in that first round. Should be very interesting to see how these two young guys try to outsmart each other, especially from Cameron's side, or bulldoze their way through their opponent the way that most likely Raul will try to. And then the last prelim fight, I would put it Tatsuro Taira versus David Vorak. Tatsuro Taira's first ranked opponent, as the guy is looking sensational right now. Very, very good grappler, and I'd like to see him up against the top 15, as there's not a lot of flyweights out there. These two guys were supposed to fight each other in October, but the fight was canceled. And now we do know that Taira is going to fight Carlos Hernandez in December. I think he can make a quick turnaround and go up against Vorak again, as he is a top 15 fighter, right? Vorak is number 15, and I expect Taira to beat Hernandez, putting together 5 wins in the UFC. 2 of those were catchweight, but regardless, I think that much success in the UFC should get him that top 15 opponent. David Vorak versus Tatsuro Taira. I do feel bad for Vorak because he got thrown Steven Erceg, who was making his debut, right? And he lost to him. And right now he's on a 3-loss streak. So it does make more sense now to replace his ranking with Tatsuro Taira. I think that's the strategy to make there. And that is my UFC 300 card. Leave in the comments below what you guys will matchmake for UFC 300. And I'll see you guys in the next video.